The summer of 1891 brought unbearable heat to West Texas. Dust. Devils danced across the barren landscape as Thomas Miller's wagon creaked along the dirt road leading to the abandoned Del Rio farmhouse. At 45, Thomas had spent his life moving from one opportunity to the next, his wife Eleanor and their 12-year-old daughter Abigail always in tow. The purchase of the farmhouse 10 miles outside of Langtree represented his greatest gamble yet. "It's magnificent," Eleanor whispered, wiping sweat from her brow as the two-story wooden structure came into view. Thomas couldn't help but feel pride at the wonder in her voice. The price had been suspiciously low, but the previous owners had left in a hurry following some family tragedy no one in town seemed willing to discuss. The farmhouse stood alone against the harsh landscape, weathered clapboard siding faded to a dull gray. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and ornate woodwork adorned the eaves. Signs of wealth now diminished by neglect. The barn, 50 yards from the main house, listed slightly to one side, its red paint peeling away in long strips. "Why is it so quiet?" Abigail asked, clutching her small suitcase as they approached. Thomas ruffled her hair. "That's the sound of opportunity, darling." Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that penetrated the drawn curtains. The Del Rios had left most of their furniture, another oddity Thomas had chosen not to question. A grandfather clock stood silent in the foyer, its hands frozen at 3:17. "I'll check upstairs," Eleanor said, always practical. "Abigail, help your father bring in our things." As they unloaded the wagon, the local man who'd driven them from town kept his distance, refusing to help carry anything inside. "I'll be back with the rest of your shipment next week," he said, already turning his horses around. "Though I can't imagine why anyone would want to stay here." "What do you mean by that?" Thomas asked. The man shook his head. "Folks say the Del Rios were good people, until they weren't." Before Thomas could press for details, the man flicked the reins and departed, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. That night, as they ate a simple meal by lantern light, Thomas laid out his plans. The fields could grow cotton if properly irrigated. The barn could house livestock. With hard work, they could build something lasting. "I hear strange noises," Abigail whispered later as Eleanor tucked her into bed in what had once been another child's room. "Like someone's walking in the attic." "It's an old house, dear," Eleanor soothed. "It's settling. You'll get used to the sounds." After Abigail fell asleep, Eleanor joined Thomas on the porch. A sliver of moon hung in the vast Texas sky, providing just enough light to see the outline of the barn. "Thomas," she said softly, "did you notice there are no photographs of the Del Rio family anywhere in the house?" "Not a single portrait. Perhaps they took them when they left," he suggested. "And yet they left everything else. Good furniture, dishes, even clothes in the wardrobes." She paused. "The real estate agent never told us why they abandoned this place, did he?" Thomas sipped from his whiskey glass. "Some tragedies are best left unexamined, Eleanor. This is our home now," as they prepared for bed. Neither mentioned the faint scratching sounds coming from somewhere within the walls or the distinct feeling of being watched. Thomas told himself it was simply the adjustment to country living after years in the city. He didn't see the small, muddy handprint that appeared on their bedroom window, visible only from the outside 12 feet above the ground. Thomas rose before dawn the next morning, determined to survey his new property in daylight. The oppressive heat had broken overnight, replaced by a peculiar chill that seemed to emanate from the house itself. He pulled on his boots and jacket, careful not to wake Eleanor. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he made his way downstairs. In the kitchen, he found the back door standing open, swinging gently in the morning breeze. "Strange," he muttered, certain they had locked up before retiring. Perhaps the latch was faulty. Outside, the farm looked different in the gray half-light. More forlorn somehow. More isolated. Thomas walked the perimeter of the house, mentally cataloging repairs. Loose shutters, rotting porch steps, a cellar door secured with a heavy padlock unlike any other lock on the property. The barn drew his attention. Inside, dust-covered farming implements hung on the walls. That once housed horses stood empty. A ladder led to a hayloft above. As Thomas climbed the rungs, he noticed something odd, a line of small objects arranged across one of the beams. Dolls. 6 tiny cornhusk dolls, each with a crude face drawn in what looked like dried blood. "Papa," Abigail's voice made him start, sat at the barn entrance still in her nightgown. "Mama says breakfast is ready." Thomas pocketed one of the dolls. "I'll be right there, darling." At breakfast, Eleanor seemed distracted. "I found something peculiar," she said, setting down her coffee cup. "There's a locked room upstairs. The key doesn't match any we were given." "I'll take a look after I finish eating," Thomas replied, not mentioning the dolls. When he examined the door in question, he found it was solid oak, unlike the pine doors throughout the rest of the house. The keyhole was ornate, almost decorative. No amount of pressure would budge it. We could ask in town, Eleanor suggested. Thomas shook his head. I'd rather not invite speculation. I'll bring tools from the barn later. That afternoon, while Eleanor and Abigail unpacked their belongings, Thomas returned to the barn to fetch a pry bar. The remaining dolls had vanished from the beam. In their place was a child's drawing etched into the wood, a house with 4 stick figures standing outside. 3 were crossed out. Back in the house, Thomas found Eleanor standing motionless in the kitchen, staring at the wall. Eleanor? She turned slowly. Did you hear that? Someone was calling my name. It's an old house, he said, echoing her words from the previous night. The wind plays tricks. The locked door upstairs yielded easily to the pry bar, swinging open to reveal a small bedroom. Unlike the rest of the house, this room had been stripped bare. No furniture, no curtains on the window. Only strange markings carved into the floorboards, circles and lines forming patterns that made Thomas's eyes hurt if he looked too long. What is it? Eleanor asked, peering past him. Nothing of interest, he said, closing the door firmly. Just an empty room. That night, as they prepared for bed, Abigail complained of a strange smell in her room. Like something died, she said. Thomas investigated but found nothing. He did notice, however, that the temperature in Abigail's room was noticeably colder than the rest of the house despite the summer heat outside. You can sleep with us tonight, Eleanor offered, exchanging a worried glance with Thomas. As they lay in the darkness, Abigail between them, a soft tapping began on the window. Tap dash tap dash tap. Pause. Tap dash tap dash tap. It's just a branch, Thomas said, though he knew there were no trees close enough to touch the house. The tapping stopped. Then from downstairs came the unmistakable sound of the front door opening, followed by footsteps crossing the foyer. Thomas, Eleanor whispered, clutching Abigail tighter. He reached for the rifle he'd placed beside the bed. Stay here. The stairs creaked beneath his weight as he descended, rifle at the ready. In the foyer, the front door stood closed and locked. The footsteps had ceased, but the grandfather clock, silent since their arrival, had begun to tick. I need to go into town for supplies, Thomas announced at breakfast 3 days after their arrival. They had settled into an uneasy routine, pretending not to notice the strange occurrences that seemed to multiply. Daily items moved from where they'd been left. Doors found open, the persistent scratching within the walls that grew loudest at night. I'll come with you, Eleanor said quickly. Too quickly. Thomas shook his head. Someone needs to stay with Abigail. I want to go too, Papa, Abigail pleaded. There were dark circles beneath her eyes. None of them had been sleeping well. Next time, he promised, knowing he couldn't leave the house unattended. Not yet. Not until he understood what was happening. The road into Langtree stretched before him like a dusty ribbon. Thomas had borrowed a horse from a neighboring farm 5 miles away, the closest neighbors they had. The farmer, a taciturn man named Wilkins, had seemed surprised when Thomas introduced himself. Didn't expect the place to sell, Wilkins had said. Not after what happened. Now, riding toward town, Thomas resolved to learn exactly what had befallen the Del Rio family. Langtree was little more than a collection of buildings serving the ranching community and travelers passing through to more prosperous places. The general store doubled as a post office. Next door stood a saloon, and across the street a small church with a cemetery behind it. As Thomas tied his horse outside the general store, he noticed a group of men watching him from the saloon porch. Their expressions were not welcoming. Inside the store, a bell jingled as he entered. The shopkeeper, a balding man with spectacles, looked up from his ledger. You must be Miller, the man said. Heard someone finally bought the Del Rio place. News travels fast, Thomas replied, producing a list of supplies. Not much else to talk about around here. The shopkeeper began gathering items. How's your family settling in? Well enough, Thomas said carefully. Though I'm curious about the previous owners. The real estate agent was rather vague. The shopkeeper's hands stilled. Some things are better left alone, Mr. Miller. I have a right to know the history of my property. After a long pause, the shopkeeper sighed. You should speak to Sheriff Dawson. He handled the investigation. Thomas found the sheriff in his office, boots propped on a scarred desk. Dawson was younger than Thomas expected, perhaps 35, with a weathered face that suggested he'd seen more than his years would indicate. The Del Rio place, huh? Dawson said after Thomas introduced himself. Figured it would rot before someone bought it. What happened there? Thomas asked directly. Dawson's eyes narrowed. Why do you want to know? Because my 12-year-old daughter's having nightmares. Because there are corn husk dolls in my barn and strange markings in a locked room. Because something isn't right, and I need to understand what I've gotten my family into. The sheriff was silent for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer and withdrew a folder. Antonio Del Rio came from money. Old Spanish land-grant family. Married a local girl, Isabel Wilkins' sister to your neighbor. They had 4 children. 4. Thomas remembered the drawing in the barn. 4 stick figures, 3 crossed out. Antonio changed after they moved to that farmhouse. Dawson continued. Became obsessed with the old well behind the barn. Started spending nights digging around it. Isabel said he'd talked about voices coming from inside, promising him things. The sheriff paused. Then the children started disappearing. Thomas felt cold despite the heat. Disappearing? One by one. First the oldest boy, then the twin girls. Antonio claimed they'd been taken, whatever that meant. We searched everywhere. Never found a trace. Dawson closed the folder. Then Isabel and the youngest boy vanished too, and Antonio hanged himself from a beam in the barn. Left a note saying they were in the well, but we searched it. Nothing there but muddy water. Dawson leaned forward. If you've got any sense, Miller, you'll get your family out of that house. Thomas rode home in silence, the sheriff's words echoing in his mind. As the farmhouse came into view, he noticed Abigail standing motionless in the yard, staring at something behind the barn. Abigail, he called, spurring the horse faster. She turned slowly, her face oddly blank. I made a friend, Papa, she said when he reached her. She says her name is Maria. She used to live here. Thomas felt his heart skip. Where's she now? Abigail pointed toward the old well, visible just beyond the barn. She went home. Thomas carried a sleeping Abigail into the house, his mind racing. He found Eleanor in the kitchen, methodically polishing silverware they had discovered in a drawer. She was sleepwalking again, he said quietly, settling Abigail on a chair. Out by the well. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly. Did she say anything? Thomas hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. She mentioned making a friend, a girl named Maria. The silver fork Eleanor had been polishing clattered to the floor. Maria Del Rio, she whispered. The youngest daughter. How do you know that name? Thomas demanded. Eleanor moved to a cupboard and withdrew a small leather-bound book. I found this hidden beneath a floorboard in our bedroom. It's Isabel Del Rio's diary. Thomas took the book, thumbing through pages filled with increasingly frantic handwriting. The earliest entries described a happy family settling into their new home. Then the tone changed. Antonio spends all his time at the well, one entry read. He says they've chosen us, that we're special. The children have begun drawing strange symbols I don't recognize. Later entries grew more disturbing. Miguel didn't come home from the well today. Antonio says he's been accepted. He won't let me go to the sheriff. Says Miguel's where he belongs now. The final entry, dated just 3 days before Antonio's suicide, was nearly illegible. The twins are gone too. Only Maria remains. I've locked her in her room for protection, but I hear them scratching at her door at night. Antonio has changed the padlock on the cellar door. He goes down there for hours. I hear him talking to something that isn't human. We must leave this place before. The entry ended abruptly. The locked room upstairs, Thomas realized. That's where Isabel kept Maria. And the cellar? Eleanor asked, her voice barely audible. Thomas stood. I need to see what's in there. Not now, Eleanor pleaded. Not in the dark. We'll go together in the morning, he agreed. All of us. I won't leave either of you alone here. That night, as they huddled together in the main bedroom, the sounds from within the walls grew louder than ever, scratching, tapping, and occasionally what sounded like children's laughter. They're getting closer, Abigail said matter-of-factly. Maria says they want to play with me. Abigail, Thomas said firmly. There is no Maria. She's just a dream. Abigail's eyes reflected the lamplight. She's not a dream, Papa. She's hiding. She's been hiding for a long time. She says the others found her family, but she got away. She's been waiting for someone to help her. Help her how? Eleanor asked, clutching her daughter's hand. Get out, Abigail replied simply. The scratching in the walls stopped abruptly. A moment later, the heavy thump of footsteps crossed the ceiling above them, the attic space that Thomas had yet to explore. Dust filtered down as whatever moved above paused directly over their bed. Thomas raised his rifle toward the ceiling. Eleanor covered Abigail's mouth to stifle her scream. The footsteps resumed, moving toward the attic stairs that descended into the hallway outside their room. The door to the attic had been locked when they arrived. Thomas had assumed it was another storage space. Now they heard the distinct sound of that door opening. Floorboards creaked in the hallway, approaching their bedroom. The doorknob turned slowly. Thomas aimed at the door, finger tightening on the trigger. The door swung open to reveal nothing. An empty hallway, dimly lit by their lamp's glow. Then a child's voice whispered from the darkness, "Help me." Dawn broke over the farmhouse, painting the weathered wood in pale gold light. None of the Millers had slept after the voice in the hallway. They had huddled together, the lamp burning all night, watching the open doorway where nothing had appeared. "We should leave," Eleanor said as she prepared a meager breakfast. Her hands shook as she poured coffee. "And go where?" Thomas asked. "This farm represents every penny we have. We could stay with my sister in Austin until what?" Thomas interrupted. "Until I find work as a day laborer? Until we're destitute again?" He softened his tone at the fear in her eyes. "We need to understand what's happening here. Then we can decide." After breakfast, Thomas retrieved an axe and a lantern from the barn. The padlock on the cellar doors was heavy and old, but it yielded to several powerful blows from the axe head. The doors themselves were solid oak, reinforced with iron bands far sturdier than necessary for a simple root cellar. "Stay behind me," Thomas instructed as he lifted one creaking door. Stale, damp air wafted up from the darkness below. Stone steps descended into blackness. The lantern's glow revealed a surprisingly large space excavated beneath the house. The cellar extended well beyond the footprint of the building above. The earthen walls had been reinforced with timbers, creating a chamber approximately 30 feet square. The floor was packed dirt. Eleanor gasped, pointing to the far wall. Symbols covered the surface, circles, lines, and strange angular characters that seemed to shift if observed too long. They matched the markings Thomas had seen in the locked room upstairs. At the center of the wall, the symbols formed a perfect circle around what appeared to be a door-sized rectangle cut into the earth. "What is this place?" Thomas whispered. "It's where they talk to us," Abigail said, her voice oddly calm. She had followed them down despite Thomas's instructions to remain upstairs. "Maria says her father dug until he found them. They told him to bring the children, so he did." "Abigail," Eleanor said sharply, "who are they?" Before Abigail could answer, a low rumble shook the cellar. Dirt sifted down from the ceiling. The symbols on the wall seemed to pulse with a faint light of their own. "We need to leave," Thomas said, grabbing Eleanor's arm. Now, they hurried up the stairs into the blinding sunlight. Thomas secured the cellar doors with a length of chain he found in the barn, though he doubted it would make any difference. "Pack only what we need," he told Eleanor. "We'll leave before nightfall." As Eleanor and Abigail gathered essentials, Thomas made a final trip to the barn to collect his tools. Inside, he found the corn-husk dolls had returned, now hanging by twine from the rafters. All six swayed gently, though there was no breeze. A soft voice behind him said, "They won't let you leave." Thomas whirled around. A girl of perhaps 10 years stood in the barn doorway, her dress old-fashioned and dirty, her dark hair hanging limply around a pale face. She seemed solid enough, but the sunlight behind her shone through her form, revealing her true nature. "Maria," Thomas said, his mouth dry. She nodded. "You shouldn't have opened the cellar. They've been waiting so long. Hungry, what are they?" Maria's expression was solemn beyond her years. "The old ones. They were here before. They'll be here after. They want the living," she pointed toward the house. "They already have her." Thomas ran, heart-pounding, axe still in hand. He burst through the back door, calling for Eleanor and Abigail. The house was silent except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock, which now read 3:17 regardless of the actual time. Upstairs, he found their bedroom empty, hastily packed bags abandoned on the bed. The door to the locked room, Maria's room, stood open. Inside, the floorboards had been pried up, revealing a narrow passage that seemed to lead down into darkness. Without hesitation, Thomas descended, the axe raised before him. The passage twisted beneath the house, roughly hewn steps leading deeper than should have been possible. It ended abruptly at what appeared to be a natural cave, illuminated by an eerie blue phosphorescence that emanated from the walls themselves. Eleanor and Abigail stood at the edge of a pool of black water that filled the center of the cave. Their backs were to him, their hands clasped as they stared into the depths. "Eleanor," Thomas called. "Abigail." They turned in unison, their movements oddly synchronized. Their eyes reflected the blue light, pupils expanded until almost no iris remained. "They're coming, Papa," Abigail said, her voice blending with Eleanor's in perfect harmony. "They're coming to meet us." They'd been so lonely, the water in the pool began to ripple, though there was no wind in the underground chamber. Something was rising from the depths. Thomas stumbled back as the surface of the black pool bulged upward. The water parted to reveal a pale, glistening appendage. Not quite an arm, not quite a tentacle, that reached toward Eleanor and Abigail. "No!" Thomas lunged forward, swinging the axe. The blade connected with a sound like wet leather splitting. Black ichor sprayed across the cave floor, sizzling where it landed. A high-pitched keening filled the chamber, painful in its intensity. The appendage withdrew into the water. Eleanor and Abigail collapsed like puppets with cut strings. Thomas gathered them in his arms, dragging them toward the passage. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open, confusion replacing the blank stare. Thomas? What? Where are we? No time, he grunted, pulling them up the rough-hewn steps as the keening behind them grew louder. The walls of the passage began to contract, dirt and stone crumbling inward as if the earth itself was trying to prevent their escape. They emerged into Maria's room just as the passage collapsed entirely, a cloud of dust billowing upward. Thomas slammed the door shut, using a chair to wedge it closed. "We need to leave," he said, helping Eleanor to her feet. "Now." Abigail remained unconscious, her breathing shallow. Thomas carried her downstairs while Eleanor followed, still disoriented. "I don't remember coming downstairs," she said as they hurried through the kitchen. "One moment I was packing and then ... double quotes," she shuddered. "I heard voices, Thomas. They promised such terrible things." Outside, the afternoon sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. Thomas placed Abigail in the wagon and began hitching their remaining horse. A sharp cry from Eleanor made him turn. Abigail was sitting up, her eyes open but unseeing. Her mouth moved, but the voice that emerged was not her own. "The well," she said in a man's deep baritone. "They're all in the well." Thomas recognized Antonio Del Rio's voice from the sheriff's description. "Abigail," he said firmly, "fight this. Come back to us." Her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "She can't hear you. None of them can. They belong to us now." Her gaze shifted to the well behind the barn. "As will you." The ground beneath their wagon trembled. A crack appeared in the dry earth, extending from the house toward them. "Go," Thomas shouted to Eleanor, slapping the horse's flank. The wagon lurched forward just as the crack widened, nearly swallowing the back wheels. Thomas ran alongside until they reached the road, then pulled himself up. Behind them, the farmhouse seemed to waver in the dying light as if seen through heat rising from desert sand. They had traveled less than a mile when Abigail suddenly convulsed, her back arching off the wagon bed. When the spasm passed, she opened her eyes, her normal, frightened eyes. "Papa," she whimpered. "I'm here," he soothed, gathering her close. "We're safe now." As if in response, a terrible sound reached them, the groan of wood under impossible stress. They turned to see the farmhouse in the distance, now enveloped in a strange mist that should not have been present in the dry Texas heat. Even from this distance, they could see the walls of the structure bulging outward, as if something enormous was pushing from within. "Don't look," Thomas told his family, urging the horse to greater speed. They reached Langtree well after dark, the town quiet except for the saloon. Thomas headed directly to the sheriff's office, where Dawson was reviewing wanted posters by lamplight. "We need help," Thomas said without preamble. "Something is in that farmhouse. Something took the Del Rio family, and it tried to take mine." Dawson studied them, Thomas wild-eyed and desperate, Eleanor trembling with Abigail clutched to her chest. After a long moment, he opened his desk drawer and withdrew a bottle of whiskey. "Tell me everything," he said. Sheriff Dawson listened without interruption as Thomas recounted their experiences, occasionally glancing at Eleanor for confirmation. When Thomas described the chamber beneath the cellar and the thing in the pool, Dawson's expression hardened. "You're not the first," he said finally, pouring another measure of whiskey. "The Del Rio place has a history. Before Antonio, there was the Hutchinson family in '83. Before them, the Jacksons in '76. All gone without explanation." "You knew?" Thomas's voice rose in disbelief. "You knew and you let us buy that place?" "I advised against it," Dawson replied evenly. "The real estate agent is required to disclose deaths on the property, not local superstitions." "Superstitions?" Eleanor's voice was brittle with anger. "That thing in the well is no superstition, Sheriff. It nearly took my daughter." Dawson sighed heavily. "There are older families in Langtree. Families that have been here since before it was Texas, before it was Mexico. They have ... stories," he hesitated, "about what lives beneath the earth. About sacrifices made to ensure the town's prosperity." "Sacrifices," Thomas repeated, the implications dawning on him. "Children. The Del Rio children." "I don't know the truth of it," Dawson admitted. "But that land where your farmhouse stands? Nothing grew there until 1850, when the first structure was built. Then suddenly the soil became fertile. The wells never ran dry, even in the worst droughts. And in exchange, it takes children," Eleanor whispered, clutching Abigail closer. A knock at the door interrupted them. Deputy Williams, barely 20 and visibly nervous, stood on the threshold. "Sheriff, we've got trouble at the old Del Rio place," he said. "Wilkins wrote in saying there's strange lights out there, and sounds like nothing he's ever heard." Thomas felt cold despite the stuffy office. "It's coming for us." "Nonsense," Dawson said, but his hand moved to the revolver at his hip. "Whatever's out there, it stays out there. Always has." Until someone opens the cellar, Thomas said. Until someone disturbs the well. A commotion outside drew them to the window. A group of townspeople had gathered in the street, pointing toward the eastern horizon where an unnatural glow pulsed against the night sky. As they watched, a tendril of light shot upward, illuminating the clouds from beneath. "Mother of God," Dawson whispered. Among the crowd, Thomas noticed several older men and women standing apart, their expressions not fearful but resigned. One of them, an elderly man leaning on a carved walking stick, caught Thomas's eye and nodded slightly. They know, Thomas realized. Some of them have always known. Dawson followed his gaze. That's Ezekiel Morgan. His family founded Langtree. If anyone knows the truth, it would be him. Despite Eleanor's protest, Thomas approached the old man. Morgan observed him with rheumy eyes that held surprising sharpness. "You opened the way," Morgan said without preamble. "After all these years of careful feeding, you opened the way." Feeding? Thomas felt sick. The children? Morgan's expression didn't change. One family every decade or so. A small price for the prosperity of hundreds. He glanced at the glow on the horizon. But now the balance is disturbed. It will not be contained to that land anymore. How do we stop it? Stop it. Morgan laughed, a dry sound like dead leaves rustling. "Boy, that thing has been here since before the first man walked these plains. You don't stop it. You appease it, or you run from it." "Then we'll run," Thomas decided. "All of us. The whole town." Morgan shook his head. "Too late for that. It's already spreading. Already hungry." As if to emphasize his point, the earth beneath their feet trembled. In the distance, the glow intensified. "There must be a way," Thomas insisted. Morgan studied him for a long moment. "There are stories," he said finally. "Old stories about a ritual of binding. But it would require a sacrifice freely given, not taken." "What kind of sacrifice?" "The kind no sane man would make," Morgan replied. He nodded toward the sheriff's office where Eleanor and Abigail waited. "The kind you're not prepared to offer." Thomas returned to the sheriff's office, Morgan's words echoing in his mind. Eleanor knew immediately that something was wrong. "What did he tell you?" she demanded. "Nothing of use," Thomas lied, unable to meet her eyes. "We need to leave. Now. Get as far from Langtree as possible." Dawson had been conferring with his deputy. "The rail station in Comstock is your best bet," he advised. 20 miles north. I'll have Williams drive you." "And the town?" Thomas asked. Dawson's expression was grim. "I'll organize an evacuation." "But people won't leave their homes based on strange lights and an outsider's wild claims." Another tremor shook the building, stronger than before. Plaster dust rained from the ceiling. "They might leave now," the deputy observed. Outside, panic had begun to spread through the gathered crowd. More people were emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion and the intensifying glow to the east. The air had grown thick, difficult to breathe, carrying a sulphurous smell. As Williams prepared a wagon for the Millers, Thomas pulled Dawson aside. "Morgan mentioned a ritual," he said quietly. "A ritual of binding. Do you know anything about it?" The sheriff's face paled. "Old wives' tales. Blood magic." "Nothing a God-fearing man should discuss, let alone consider. If it could save the town, it can't," Dawson interrupted harshly. "And the price is too high." Before Thomas could press further, a terrible sound split the night, a low, reverberating call that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Several townspeople fell to their knees, covering their ears. Dogs throughout Langtree began to howl. In the sheriff's office, Abigail screamed. Thomas and Dawson rushed inside to find Eleanor struggling to hold Abigail, who thrashed violently on the wooden bench where she had been resting. "Something's inside her," Eleanor cried. Abigail's eyes had rolled back in her head, showing only whites. Her mouth worked silently, forming words no human throat could produce. "It's calling to her," Morgan said from the doorway. The old man had followed them, his ancient face impassive as he watched Abigail's seizure. "It has tasted her once. It won't let her go easily. Help her," Thomas begged. "Please." Morgan approached slowly, leaning heavily on his walking stick. He placed a gnarled hand on Abigail's forehead, muttering words in a language Thomas didn't recognize. Gradually, Abigail's thrashing subsided, though her breathing remained labored. "I've quieted its voice temporarily," Morgan explained, "but I cannot break its hold. For that, we would need the ritual." He fixed Thomas with an uncompromising stare. "Are you willing to hear the cost now?" Thomas looked at Eleanor, at their daughter's pale face. Outside, another tremor shook the town. The unearthly call sounded again, closer this time. "Tell me," he said. Morgan led them to a small room at the back of the sheriff's office, away from curious ears. There, he revealed what the oldest families of Langtree had kept secret for generations. "The thing beneath the Del Rio farm is ancient," Morgan began. It slept until white settlers disturbed its rest. My grandfather was among them. They found a cavern while digging a well, a cavern that should not have existed at that depth. Inside was a pool of black water and walls covered with symbols no human hand could have carved. The same symbols in the cellar, Thomas confirmed. Morgan nodded. My grandfather was a learned man. He recognized their significance from forbidden texts he had studied in his youth. The symbols were a binding, a prison of sorts, keeping the entity contained. But the act of discovery weakened that binding, so it escaped, Eleanor said. Not entirely. It exists in a liminal state, either fully bound nor fully free. It can reach out, influence minds, even manifest physically to some extent, but only within the boundary of the original binding. The farm, Thomas realized. Yes, but now you've broken the inner seals in the cellar. The binding weakens further. Morgan's rheumy eyes fixed on Abigail. It has touched your daughter's mind, established a connection. Through her, it will extend its influence beyond the farm. How do we stop it? Thomas demanded. The ritual of binding requires 3 elements, Morgan explained. Blood freely given from one who has been touched by the entity, earth from the place of its manifestation, and a soul to serve as anchor. Eleanor gasped. A soul? What does that mean? Morgan's expression remained impassive. Someone must voluntarily bind themselves to the entity, become its keeper, its jailer. Remain on that land for as long as they live, maintaining the symbols, renewing the binding with their own lifeblood. And after they die? Thomas asked, though he already suspected the answer. Their spirit remains bound, forever. Morgan's voice softened slightly. It is not a fate I would wish on anyone. The implications were clear. To save Abigail, to save Langtree, someone would have to sacrifice not just their life, but their very soul, condemned to an eternity of imprisonment with the thing beneath the well. I'll do it, Thomas said without hesitation. Thomas, no, Eleanor cried. He took her hands. What choice do we have? It has Abigail. It will take her completely if we don't stop it. Then I'll do it, she countered, tears streaming down her face. She needs her father. She needs her mother, Thomas insisted. You know, that's true. Before Eleanor could argue further, another tremor rocked the building, this one strong enough to crack the walls. From outside came screams of terror. If you're going to do this, Morgan said urgently, it must be now, before it breaks free entirely. Thomas knelt beside Abigail, who had fallen into a fitful sleep after Morgan's intervention. He brushed damp hair from her forehead. I'll keep you safe, he whispered. I promise. He stood and faced Morgan. What do we need for the ritual? The wagon rattled along the road toward the Del Rio farm, its occupants grimly silent. Thomas held the reins, with Morgan beside him, clutching a leather satchel containing the ritual components. In the back, Dawson sat with his shotgun across his knees, watching the pulsing glow that grew brighter as they approached. Eleanor had remained in town with Abigail, protected by Deputy Williams and several armed townspeople. The entity will resist, Morgan warned as the farmhouse came into view. It will try to stop us any way it can. The scene before them was nightmarish. The farmhouse stood at the center of a maelstrom of unnatural energy. The air itself seemed to ripple around the structure, distorting the moonlight. The ground had split open in dozens of places, fissures radiating outward from the house like cracks in glass. From these openings rose a phosphorescent mist that coiled and twisted in patterns too deliberate to be random. My God, Dawson breathed. Thomas felt fear threatening to overwhelm him, but the thought of Abigail, her blank eyes as the entity spoke through her, hardened his resolve. Where do we perform the ritual? He asked Morgan. The well, the old man replied. It's the oldest point of contact, the original breach. They approached cautiously, the horse growing increasingly agitated until Thomas was forced to halt and continue on foot. The ground shook continuously now, forcing them to fight for balance with every step. The well stood behind the barn, a simple stone structure that seemed unremarkable except for the mist that poured from it like water flowing upward. As they drew closer, Thomas could hear sounds emanating from its depths, whispers, moans, and occasionally a child's laughter. Morgan opened his satchel and produced a clay jar filled with soil from the cellar, collected earlier by Dawson's men. Next came a silver knife, its blade inscribed with symbols matching those in the underground chamber. Your blood must be spilled willingly into the well, Morgan instructed Thomas. As it falls, I will speak the words of binding. When they are complete, you must ... double quotes. He hesitated. You must give yourself to the well. Physically enter it. Thomas stared into the mist-shrouded opening. Be consumed. Your body, yes, Morgan confirmed.
Your spirit will become part of the body.
Holding the entity in check. Will it hurt? Thomas asked, hating the tremor in his voice. I don't know, Morgan answered honestly. No one who has completed the ritual has ever returned to tell. A sudden violent tremor nearly knocked them off their feet. The farmhouse groaned, its timbers bending at impossible angles as something pushed against the structure from below. It knows what we intend, Morgan shouted over the rising wind. We must hurry. Thomas rolled up his sleeve, accepting the ritual knife from Morgan. Before he could begin, a familiar voice called his name. Papa! He turned to see Abigail standing at the edge of the yard, Eleanor nowhere in sight. Abigail, how'd you get here? Thomas started toward her, but Morgan grabbed his arm. It's not her, the old man warned. The entity takes forms familiar to us. The thing wearing Abigail's face smiled, the expression all wrong on his daughter's features. Smart old man, it said, its voice a disturbing blend of Abigail's childish tones and something ancient and inhuman, but not smart enough. The ground beneath Morgan erupted, a geyser of dirt and stone throwing the old man several yards away. He landed with a sickening crack and lay motionless. Morgan. Dawson rushed to the fallen man while Thomas faced the entity. Let my daughter go, he demanded. Why would I release such a perfect vessel? Notabile tilted her head. Young, innocent, with so many years ahead of her. Years I could use to walk among you. To feed. Take me instead, Thomas offered, echoing the terms of the ritual. Willingly given. The entity considered him, its expression calculating beneath Abigail's features. A father's sacrifice. How predictable. It approached until it stood directly before him. But acceptable. Thomas held his ground despite every instinct screaming to flee. Swear you'll release her. Swear you'll trouble Langtree no more. Such demands, it chuckled. But yes, I accept your terms. The girl will be freed. The town spared. It extended Abigail's small hand. Do we have an agreement? Thomas hesitated, remembering Morgan's warnings about the ritual's specific requirements. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Without the proper binding, would his sacrifice mean anything? A groan from behind him made him turn. Morgan had regained consciousness, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. The old man locked eyes with Thomas and nodded once. Understanding flowed between them. Morgan would complete the ritual. Thomas just needed to ensure the entity was in position. We have an agreement, Thomas said, taking the thing's outstretched hand. Instantly, pain shot up his arm as if his blood had turned to fire. The entity's grip was impossibly strong, crushing his fingers as it pulled him toward the well. Its disguise began to slip. Abigail's features melting away to reveal something Thomas's mind could barely comprehend, a face composed of too many angles. Eyes that were not eyes but rather tears in reality itself. Behind them, Morgan had dragged himself to his knees and begun a guttural chant, the ritual words forcing themselves past his bloodied lips. He clutched the jar of earth in one hand, the silver knife in the other. The entity screamed, a sound that shattered the remaining windows in the farmhouse. It released Thomas and turned toward Morgan, but Thomas tackled it from behind, driving them both toward the well. Now! Thomas shouted to Morgan as they teetered on the edge. The old man plunged the knife into his own palm, letting blood drip onto the ritual earth. The mixture began to glow with an inner light that pushed back against the unnatural mist. Blood freely given, Morgan intoned, voice growing stronger. Earth from the place of manifestation. A soul to serve as anchor. The entity thrashed in Thomas's grip, its form shifting rapidly. Maria del Rio, Antonio, and finally something so alien that Thomas had to close his eyes or risk losing his sanity. I bind you, Morgan continued, flinging the glowing mixture into the well. I seal you. I imprison you beneath the earth from whence you came. Thomas felt the entity weakening in his grasp. With a final surge of strength, he pushed it over the edge of the well, but it caught him with a tendril-like appendage, pulling him after it. As they fell into darkness, Thomas heard Morgan complete the ritual, with this soul as eternal warden, bound in service until the stars burn cold and the last light fades from creation. Thomas didn't scream. He thought of Eleanor, of Abigail, of the life they would have without him. It was enough. The darkness swallowed him whole. Langtree, Texas, September 1892. 1 year later, Eleanor Miller adjusted her bonnet as she stepped down from the stagecoach, her gloved hand steadying Abigail, who followed close behind. The town looked much as they remembered it, a dusty collection of buildings shimmering in the heat of late summer. Are you sure about this? The stagecoach driver asked, handing down their luggage. Folks say that place is cursed. It's our home, Eleanor replied simply, and we've come to pay our respects. Sheriff Dawson met them outside his office, his face more lined than when they had last seen him. He removed his hat in greeting. Mrs. Miller, Miss Abigail, it's good to see you both. How's the town, Sheriff? Eleanor asked. Quiet, Dawson replied. No disturbances since. Since that night, the earth settled, the lights stopped, life returned to normal. He glanced at Abigail. "How is she?" Eleanor smiled softly. "Better. She remembers little of what happened, thankfully. The nightmares have mostly stopped." Abigail had wandered to a nearby hitching post, seemingly fascinated by a butterfly that had landed there. She looked like any normal 13-year-old girl, the shadows that had haunted her eyes gradually fading over the past year. "And the dreams?" Dawson asked in a lower voice. "The ones you wrote about?" Eleanor's smile faltered. "Still the same. Thomas calling to us, asking us to visit, saying he's found a way to contain it, but that he's lonely." Dawson nodded grimly. Morgan warned this might happen. The entity using Thomas's form, his memories, to lure you back. "Is Mr. Morgan ... IT past last winter?" Dawson said. "The ritual took too much from him, but he prepared me before he went. Taught me what to watch for." Eleanor gazed down the road leading east out of town toward the farmhouse they had fled a year ago. "We won't stay long. Just long enough to say goodbye properly. I can't recommend going out there," Dawson warned. "The place stands empty. No one will buy it now, not after the stories spread." "We've come all the way from Austin," Eleanor said firmly. "We need this closure. Both of us do." Dawson sighed, recognizing the determination in her eyes. "I'll drive you out there myself then, but we leave before sundown, no matter what." The farmhouse looked smaller than Eleanor remembered, diminished somehow. The once white clapboards had weathered to gray and weeds choked what had been their vegetable garden. The barn listed more severely, one corner of its roof partially collapsed. "It's so quiet," Abigail whispered as they approached the front porch. Eleanor squeezed her daughter's hand. "What did you expect, darling?" Abigail frowned. "In my dreams, there was music. Papa playing his fiddle on the porch." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine despite the heat. Thomas had indeed owned a fiddle, though he had played it rarely and with little skill. "Dreams are just dreams," she assured Abigail, though she caught Dawson's troubled glance. They didn't enter the house. Instead, they walked around to the small plot behind the barn where, according to Dawson, the townspeople had erected a memorial stone for Thomas after the events of that night, though no body had been recovered. They had performed a Christian burial service at Eleanor's request before she and Abigail had departed for Austin. The simple granite marker read, "Thomas Miller, 1846-1891, beloved husband and father, greater love hath nitrogen monoxide man." Eleanor placed the wildflowers they had gathered on their journey before the stone. She bowed her head in prayer while Abigail stood silently beside her. After a moment, Abigail wandered a few steps away, drawn to the old well that still stood, now sealed with heavy wooden planks secured by iron bands. She placed her small hand on the stones, a curious expression crossing her face. "Abigail," Dawson called sharply. "Step away from there." The girl obeyed, but not before whispering something that made Eleanor's heart skip a beat. "What did you say, darling?" she asked, moving to her daughter's side. "I say goodbye to Papa," Abigail replied, her eyes clear and innocent. "He says he misses us, but we shouldn't come back again. He says it's not safe." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Dawson, whose hand had moved to rest on his holstered revolver. "Is he, is Papa in there?" Eleanor asked carefully, nodding toward the sealed well. Abigail shook her head. "Not anymore. He's everywhere on this land now. He says he had to spread himself thin like butter over too much bread to keep the hungry thing contained." A sudden breeze swept across the yard, stirring the wildflowers on Thomas's grave. It carried the faint, almost imperceptible sound of fiddle strings being plucked one by one. "We should go," Dawson said, his voice tight. "Now." As they turned to leave, Eleanor noticed something she had overlooked before, a line of small objects placed on the porch steps. 6 corn husk dolls, their crude faces now smiling rather than threatening. "Thomas?" she whispered. The breeze picked up again, swirling around them like an embrace before dying away. For just a moment, Eleanor thought she caught the scent of Thomas's tobacco, the sound of his quiet laugh. Then there was only the Texas heat, the buzz of insects, and the long road back to Langtree. "Goodbye," Eleanor said softly to the empty air. "Rest well, my love." As they drove away, none of them saw the weathered curtain in the farmhouse window twitch aside briefly, revealing a pale face watching their departure. Not Thomas, but a young girl with dark hair and solemn eyes, Maria Del Rio, standing eternal vigil alongside the new guardian of the land. The Del Rio farmhouse would stand for many years after, through drought and storm, always empty, yet never quite abandoned. Local children would dare each other to approach its gate, to touch the weathered fence posts and run away before the whispers started. Travelers would report strange lights in the windows at night, the sound of a fiddle playing melancholy tunes that carried across the flat Texas landscape. But the hunger beneath the earth remained contained, bound by a father's sacrifice and a love that transcended death itself. Some say that on the anniversary of that terrible night, those with keen ears can hear a man's voice carried on the wind, repeating a single phrase over and over: "Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for those he loves," and in Langtree they remember. They always will.